Every one of these machines was sentenced to die, engineers drew up the replacements, accountants signed the death warrants, the trade papers printed the obituaries, and then nothing happened. They kept running, they outlived the companies that built them, the rivals meant to bury them, and sometimes the very countries that designed them. From a war engine built to survive a single winter, to an American giant that simply would not quit, here are 10 locomotives that refuse to be replaced. Number 10, the EMD GP9. Let's start with a machine that was itself a replacement and then turned around and refused to be replaced in turn. In the 1950s, North America was killing steam. The weapon of choice was a plain, slab-sided diesel road switcher from General Motors' Electromotive division, the GP9 or GEEP. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't fast. It made 1,750 horsepower from a 16-cylinder 567C engine and rode on a pair of unremarkable Blomberg trucks. Between 1954 and 1963, EMD and its Canadian arm built more than 4,000 of them, the single most produced model EMD had ever made. And here's the part nobody planned. The GP9 was supposed to be a stepping stone. Bigger, more powerful diesels were coming almost immediately, turbocharged units that made the Jeep look obsolete inside a decade. By the 1980s, most big railroads had officially retired theirs. But the GP9 didn't go to the scrapyard. It went underground, into the bloodstream of the entire continent. Railroads discovered the thing was almost impossible to wear out. So instead of replacing it, they rebuilt it over and over. Canadian National turned theirs into GP9 RMs. Illinois Central chopped the hoods down and called them GP10s. EMD itself is still rebuilding GP9 frames today with modern engines. 7 decades after the first one rolled out of LaGrange, Illinois, rebuilt GP9s are still shunting steel mills, switching grain elevators, and crawling along short lines from Ontario to Argentina. Canadian National alone still had nearly 30 of them on the books in the 2020s, and EMD's modern eco-rebuild program takes the original 1950s frame and drops in a clean new engine, meaning a railroad in the 21st century can buy what is, underneath, a 70-year-old locomotive. Think about that. A locomotive built to end one era has now outlasted every locomotive that was supposed to end it. The Jeep was designed to be a tool. It became furniture. And you genuinely cannot kill it. That's our gentle opener. It gets stranger from here. Number 9, the British Rail Class 08 Gronk cross the Atlantic and meet the most numerous locomotive class Britain ever built, and one of the most stubborn. The Class 08 is a squat little diesel-electric shunting engine with an A60 wheel arrangement, side connecting rods like a steam engine, and a low grumbling idle that earned it the nickname Gronk. British Railways built 996 of them between 1952 and 1962, spread across 5 different workshops. They were everywhere, every yard, every station, every depot. If a train needed shoving around in Britain, an A08 did the shoving. They were such a fixture of the railway that when the Thomas the Tank Engine stories needed diesel characters, several of the most famous, including Diesel himself, were drawn from the humble 08. Then the entire reason for its existence disappeared. By the 1970s and 80s, British Railways stopped assembling trains from loose wagons. Freight became fixed blocks of containers. Passenger trains became self-propelled units that never needed a shunter to pull them apart. The job the 08 was built for simply ended. Hundreds were withdrawn, stored, scrapped, sold off, and yet walk onto the British main line today in 2026 and you will still find Class 08s at work. 70-odd years after the first one was built, Network Rail uses them, DB Cargo uses them, freight operators keep them as yard pilots because nothing modern does the job any better or cheaper. On top of that, more than 80 are preserved, and almost every heritage railway in Britain uses one as its works shunter. Because unlike a steam engine, you just turn the key and it goes. The Bo-8 was built for a world of clattering wagons and steam-age marshalling yards. That world is dead. The Bo-8 is not. It is, quietly, one of the longest-lived diesel designs in the history of railways. A machine that survived by being too simple, too reliable, and too useful to ever quite justify killing. Number 8. the British Rail Class 37 tractor. Stay in Britain because the British seem to have had a particular talent for building diesels that won't lie down. The Class 37, officially the English Electric Type 3, arrived between 1960 and 1965. 309 were built at Vulcan Foundry and at Robert Stephenson and Hawthorne's. They had a long, handsome twin-cab body, a cab at each end so they never needed turning, and a 12-cylinder engine making 1,750 horsepower. Crews loved the deep, throaty roar of that engine so much, the locomotive picked up nicknames: the tractor, the growler, the siphon. It was a mixed-traffic workhorse. It hauled intercity expresses across East Anglia and Scotland, dragged coal and steel and stone, and went almost anywhere on the network thanks to its 6-axle design spreading the weight. Now, the railway tried to move on. Newer, flashier classes came and went. Whole generations of supposedly superior diesels were ordered, ran their service lives, and were scrapped, while the Class 37 just kept going. The secret was that bomb-proof engine and a body strong enough to rebuild. So British Rail rebuilt them again and again into a whole alphabet of subclasses that pushed their working lives out by decades. Here's the punchline. In 2026, more than 60 years after the first one was built, around 40 Class 37s are still in mainline service, hauling engineering trains, test trains, and the occasional charter for operators like Direct Rail Services and Colas Rail. Locomotives that were drawing express trains when the Beatles were a new band are still earning their keep today. The Class 37 outlived its rivals, not by being clever, but by being durable, and by being loved enough that someone always found a reason to keep it running. Number 7. The EMD SD40-2, back to America and to the diesel that became so good at its job that the industry essentially stopped trying to replace it. When EMD launched the SD40-2 in January 1972, it was just one option in a crowded catalog. 3,000 horsepower, 6 axles, a turbocharged 16-cylinder engine, riding on a new long-wheelbase truck called the HTC. On paper, more powerful locomotives already existed. EMD even sold a bigger one alongside it. But the SD40-2 had a quality that mattered more than raw power. It almost never broke. The reliability and flexibility of that 3,000 horsepower machine made it one of the best-selling locomotives in EMD's entire history. Second only to the GP9 from number 10 on this list. Around 4,000 were built, pouring out of the factory through the 1970s and into the mid-1980s. They hauled coal, grain, intermodal, everything, everywhere across North America. And then they refused to retire? When something newer and shinier came along, railroads ran the numbers and made the same decision over and over. Don't buy new, rebuild the SD40-2. Take the rugged frame, drop in fresh electronics, and you've got another 20 years. The result is a swarm of rebuilds with names like SD43 and SD40M2, plus second-hand units sold down the food chain to regional and short-line railroads that couldn't afford anything else. Specialist versions like the tunnel motors, built to gulp cooler air on the steep mountain lines of the Southern Pacific and the Rio Grande, were so prized that they were rebuilt and resold again and again. Half a century after that first one was built, the SD40-2 is still out there in serious numbers, leading freights, working yards, roaming short lines from Quebec to Mexico. It became the industry standard for decades, and then it became the industry's hand-me-down that simply wouldn't die. The SD40-2 wasn't the most powerful locomotive of its generation. It was something better for survival, the one that was never quite worth replacing. Number 6, the South African Class 25 and the Red Devil. Now we leave the world of diesels and walk into the desert to a steam locomotive built to do something almost impossible. The problem in South Africa's Great Karoo was water. The desert lines from De Aar to Kimberley crossed hundreds of kilometers of bone-dry scrub, and a normal steam engine drinks water constantly. It boils it, blasts it out the chimney, and dies of thirst. So in 1953, working with the German firm Henschel, South African Railways built something extraordinary. The Class 25, a giant 484 with a condensing tender. Instead of throwing its used steam away, it caught it, cooled it, and turned it back into water, like a camel for the railways. 90 condensers and 50 planar non-condensing versions were built between 1953 and 1955. A condensing 25 could run hundreds of kilometers between water stops. its tender topped with great cooling fans whining as it crossed the Karoo. These engines made the DR Kimberley line one of the very last strongholds of heavy mainline steam on Earth, lasting into the early 1990s, long after most of the world had dieselized. But the best part of this story is one specific locomotive. In 1981, an engineer named David Wardale took a single-tired Class 25, number 3450, and rebuilt it using advanced ideas from the Argentine engineer L.D. Porta. He painted it red. They called it the Red Devil. And it was a revelation. Roughly 28% less coal, 30% less water, and over 40% more power than a standard 25. It was living proof that steam, modernized, could still beat diesel on cost in a coal-rich, oil-poor country. And it didn't matter. The decision to dieselize had already been made. The Red Devil arrived too late to change anyone's mind. It became the most advanced steam locomotive of its kind, a machine that refused to accept that its entire technology was obsolete and was overruled anyway. Number 5. The DRB Class 52 Kriegslok. This next one is the strangest survivor of all, because it was deliberately designed to be thrown away. In 1942, wartime Germany needed locomotives, thousands of them, to feed the Eastern Front, and it needed them fast and cheap. The answer was the Class 52, the Kriegslok locomotive, or war locomotive. It was a stripped-down version of an existing freight engine, redesigned to use the fewest parts and the cheapest materials possible. The scarce metals, copper, bronze, nickel, were dropped. These engines were never expected to survive long. The brutal truth is that many were built using forced labor, and the planners assumed the machines themselves would be destroyed or worn out within months. More than 7,000 were built. It became one of the most numerous steam locomotives in the entire world. And then the war ended, and the disposable engine refused to disappear. Because it was so simple and so rugged, the Class 52 was exactly what a shattered, broke continent needed. The Soviet Union took more than 2,000 of them. Poland ran over 1,000 under the class name Tai-2 and kept some in regular service all the way to 1999. East Germany rebuilt hundreds with new boilers. Austria ran them until 1976. In Bosnia, a handful kept hauling coal in industrial service into the 2010s. Sit with that. A locomotive built in 1943 to last maybe one winter, built under the worst circumstances imaginable, went on to work for over 50 years across a dozen countries. The engine, designed to be the most temporary machine of the entire war, became one of the most permanent. There's even a story that as late as 2007, a Swiss railway pressed a preserved Class 52 into service on a work train because the old war engine burned no diesel fuel and made almost no noise standing idle, a 1940s relic quietly outgreening a modern locomotive. It refused to be replaced because in the rubble of post-war Europe, there was simply nothing to replace it with. And by the time there was, it had already proven it would outlast everyone's expectations by half a century. Number 4. Cuba's American Sugar Steam. For our next survivors, we go to an island where history didn't just slow down, it froze solid. For a century, Cuba ran on sugar, and the sugar ran on rail. Every February, the Zafra, the great cane harvest, fired up an army of steam locomotives that hauled cut cane from the fields to the mills. And these weren't Cuban engines. They were American, Baldwins, and other US-built steam locomotives, many of them dating from the 1910s and 1920s, some from as far back as 1903. In the rest of the world, engines like these were scrapped by the 1950s. In Cuba, they kept running, and the reason is pure 20th century history. After the revolution, the United States imposed an embargo. Cuba couldn't buy American replacements or even spare parts for modern machinery. Then, in the 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed and took Cuba's economic lifeline with it. So Cuban mill mechanics did the only thing they could. They kept the ancient American steam engines alive by hand, machining parts that no factory had made in 70 years. The result was almost unbelievable. By the late 1990s, Little Cuba had become home to one of the largest concentrations of working steam locomotives left on the planet, perhaps 100 of them, firing up each harvest. Antique American iron laboring through cane fields under a Caribbean sun, watched by stunned railway enthusiasts who'd flown halfway around the world to see ghosts that were still alive. Almost all of them had been converted to burn oil instead of coal, and some were genuine centenarians, still earning their living 100 years after they were built. For a railway historian, walking into a Cuban sugar mill in the 1990s was like stepping into a living photograph of America in 1920. It couldn't last forever. When Cuba restructured its sugar industry in 2002, roughly half the mills closed, and most of the steam fell silent over the following few years. But for a few extraordinary decades, the locomotives that America built and forgot were kept running by the very embargo meant to isolate the island. They weren't preserved out of nostalgia, they simply refused to be replaced because nothing was allowed in to replace them. Number 3. India's bullet-nosed Pacifics. Now to a locomotive that ran longer and harder than almost anyone expected in a country that loved it. After the Second World War, India needed a fast, powerful express passenger engine, one that could burn the low-grade, high-ash coal India actually had. The answer was the WP, a magnificent 462 Pacific with a distinctive bullet-shaped nose on the front, very often painted with a star. The first batch came from Baldwin in America in 1947, the year of independence. In total, 755 were built over 2 decades, the later ones from India's own Chittaranjan works. The bullet nose wasn't just for show. These were engines designed from the ground up around India's difficult coal and India's vast distances, machines meant to run enormous through workings of 600 or 700 kilometers. Through the 1960s and 70s, the WP was the fastest thing on Indian railways, hauling the country's most prestigious trains, the Grand Trunk Express, the Frontier Mail, at up to 110 kilometers an hour. Diesels and electrics were supposed to sweep these Pacifics away, and eventually they did, but it took far, far longer than anyone planned. Around 1990, India still had roughly 2,300 steam locomotives at work. The bullet-nosed Pacifics and their cousins were still pounding the rails when most of the world had been diesel for 30 years. And then came the end, and it has a poetic geography to it. On the 6th of December 1995, a locomotive of the related WL class, number 15,005, nicknamed Sheri Punjab, the Lion of Punjab, hauled the last official broad-gauge steam train on Indian railways. Its route from Ferozepur to Jalandhar in the Punjab. After nearly a century and a half, the age of mainline steam in India ended on a quiet line in the country's north. A few meter-gauge survivors clung on in Gujarat until February 2000, and then they too went cold. The bullet-nosed Pacifics didn't refuse replacement out of stubborn machinery alone. They survived because a vast, hard-working railway needed every engine it had and kept them running until the very last possible day. Number 2, China's QJ and the last great steam show. Our second to last machine carries an almost unbelievable title. It was the locomotive that kept mainline steam alive on Earth into the 21st century. While the rest of the world spent the 1960s and 70s frantically scrapping steam, China did the opposite. It made a deliberate national choice to keep building it. The result was the QJ, a huge 210-2 freight locomotive, the backbone of Chinese heavy haulage. They built 4,717 of them, and astonishingly, production didn't stop until 1988, by which point almost no one else on the planet was manufacturing new steam locomotives at all. China's national railways did eventually dieselize, retiring the QJ from the main system around the start of the 2000s. But the story doesn't end there. As the big railways cast them off, China's local and industrial lines snapped them up, because you could buy several freshly overhauled QJs for the price of a single diesel. The greatest of these holdouts was the Jitong Railway in Inner Mongolia. This was a brand new line. It only opened in 1995, and yet it chose to run on steam because the country had so many QJs going spare. Around 100 of them hauled long, heavy freights across the spectacular Jingpeng Pass, where the lines spiraled through tunnels and over viaducts in the freezing northern winter. Railway photographers called it the last great steam show on the planet, and they came from every continent to stand in the snow and watch double-headed QJs storm the grade, blasting white plumes into a blue sky. It ended on the 8th of December 2005. On that day, 2 QJs hauled the final double-headed mainline steam freight, and the last regular long-distance steam operation anywhere in the world came to a close. A few of these Chinese giants were even shipped to the United States afterward, where a couple ran excursions on the Iowa Interstate Railroad. Chinese steam engines, built in the 1980s, pulling American passengers in the 21st century. The QJ refused to be replaced for a remarkable reason. It was newer, cheaper, and more abundant than the diesels meant to bury it. For one extraordinary decade, the future of railways ran on the past. Number 1. The Pennsylvania Railroad GG1. And finally, the machine that outlived the company that built it, the company that bought that one, and very nearly the people who tried to retire it. In the 1930s, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the self-styled standard railroad of the world, needed an electric locomotive to rule its New York-Washington main line. What it got was the GG1, a long, low, streamlined monster clad in welded steel and styled by the legendary industrial designer Raymond Loewy, with 5 gold pinstripes running its length. Between 1934 and 1943, 139 were built. Each one produced over 4,600 horsepower continuously, could surge far higher in a sprint, and would cruise at 100 miles an hour all day long. It was, by wide agreement, the finest electric locomotive North America ever produced. And it would not die. The Pennsylvania Railroad itself died first, merged out of existence into Penn Central in 1968. Penn Central died too, collapsing into the largest bankruptcy America had ever seen. The GG1 just kept running. It passed to Conrail, it passed to Amtrak, it passed to New Jersey Transit. Decades went by. Other locomotives came and went. The GG1 hauled presidential funeral trains, crack expresses, and humble commuter runs with equal indifference, often with the same engines that had started work before the Second World War. Replacing it turned out to be genuinely hard. Amtrak had to import European designs and test them before settling on a modern replacement, and even then, a handful of GG1s clung on with New Jersey Transit. The very last one ran in revenue service in October 1983, 49 years after the design first appeared. In the end, it wasn't a better locomotive that beat the GG1. It was old age and chemistry, cracks in the frames after millions of miles, and the discovery that their massive transformers were full of hazardous PCB oil. These were machines with real history written into them. One GG1 famously overran the platform at Washington Union Station in 1953 and crashed straight through the concourse floor into the basement, and was hauled out, repaired, and put back to work. Another, Big Red, was lovingly repainted in classic Tuscan livery and ran right up to the final farewell. 49 years, 3 or 4 owners. A locomotive that outlived 2 entire railroads and several generations of engineers who swore it was finished. The GG1 is the purest example on this list of a machine that simply refused to accept that its time was up. 16 survive in museums today, silent now, but still, somehow, the standard against which everything else is measured. If you enjoyed this, tell me in the comments which forgotten locomotive you'd add to the list, and which of these 10 surprised you most. Subscribe for more stories from the strange, stubborn history of the railways, and I'll see you down the line.